Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org, and this is the Viltrox 24mm f1.8 lens for Sony E-mount here, but it's also available for Nikon Z-mount. The lens is relatively compact at 3.3 inches long and weighing about 3/4 of a pound, but it does not have any weather sealing. If you want to use filters, it has 55mm diameter threads, and it comes with a petal-shaped hood. It has a manual aperture ring with no clicks, giving it a lot of potential for video shooters. What probably draws most people to this lens, though, is its price, $429. This video is mostly going to focus on the Viltrox lens, but I'll also be comparing it with the Sigma 24mm f2 I-series lens, which is basically the same weight but 1 centimeter shorter. It lets in 1/3 of a stop less light and costs $200 more, and has some basic weather sealing. Both of these lenses have manual aperture rings, but the Sigma's has a click at every 1/3 of a stop. I love how this aperture ring feels. It's smooth and easy to turn, and the metal ring has deep teeth that make it easy to grip. The Viltrox lens has no clicks between aperture settings, and while the focus ring on this lens feels wonderfully smooth, the aperture ring on this one is not. It's actually a bit too stiff and hard to turn, and instead of being smooth, it's a bit sticky and even squeaky. It seems to be getting a little bit better with use though. Neither lens has a lock on the aperture ring, and the Viltrox does not have a manual focus switch on the lens. It does, however, have a USB port on the lens mount, which allows for quick firmware updates on the lens, which is a good idea. Before we take a look at these lenses' resolution, let's take a look at their distortion characteristics. Here I've turned off the lens profile corrections for both lenses. This is what the Sigma lens looks like without correction, and this is the Viltrox. Sigma, Viltrox. You can probably tell pretty easily that without correction, the Sigma has quite a bit more barrel distortion than the Viltrox. Now, let me show you what the corrected Viltrox image looks like. With the corrections applied, we can see that there's a little bit of flattening, but it's not a huge amount. The result is an image with some pretty minor barrel distortion. Now here's the Sigma's corrected version. And when we compare it to the Viltrox's corrected version, we see that the Sigma's ends up with even less barrel distortion, although they're really both pretty similar. Now these are just the lens profiles that are available in Lightroom, and you can always make further adjustments if you want to. Okay, now let's take a look at the kind of resolution that we can get with this Viltrox lens. One afternoon, I took a quick drive over to a local park and took these test shots from the trail. I shot these using my 42 megapixel Sony a7R III from a sturdy tripod using my standard methodology. Starting in the center of the frame, with both lenses wide open, they're both pretty good already, but looking at the bark on this cedar tree, it's clear that the Sigma is quite a bit sharper. Stopping down just 1/3 of a stop to f2 on the Viltrox, there's a significant improvement, but the Sigma does remain a bit sharper. And that remains true as we stop the lenses down to f2.8, then f4, and f5.6. At f8, the Viltrox is as good as it will ever get, and the Sigma still looks like it has slightly better resolution. It's mostly the better contrast that makes it sharper. I'm really impressed with the Sigma here, but I'd be happy with the center resolution from either lens most of the time. As we move further away from the center of the image though, those differences get bigger. Here, with both lenses wide open, the Sigma looks about as sharp as it did in the center, but the Viltrox is getting a bit smeary looking. Stopping down to f2, the Viltrox does show a significant improvement again, but we are losing a fair amount of detail. The same pattern continues here, with the Viltrox improving as we stop down to f8. At f5.6, it's starting to look really good, and at f8, it's even better, but it doesn't quite match the Sigma. Looking at the same set of images down in the lower corner, we see the biggest difference yet with both lenses wide open. You don't even need to look at these full screen to see the difference in this dry branch in the center, which is nice and sharp on the Sigma side and very blurry with the Viltrox. Stopping down to f2, the Viltrox doesn't show as much improvement this time. It's still quite blurry, and it remains blurry until about f5.6, where it starts to get respectable again, although it's not as sharp as the Sigma was at f2. And at f8, it's the same again, sharper, but it still doesn't catch up with the Sigma. I shot tests like this in several locations, but I had a lot of weather problems. I'm going to show you an abbreviated version of this one, even though it started raining between my shooting with the Sigma and the Viltrox, which makes it a little hard to read. In the center, there's not enough fine detail to see a big difference, but down at the bottom of the screen in the tree branches, it's more obvious that the Viltrox is a bit blurry. Stopping down to f2 on the Viltrox, we get a significant improvement again, but the Sigma is still sharper. At f5.6 and f8, they've gotten pretty close, but the Sigma remains sharper still. Away from the center here, there's a lot more detail, and it makes it much easier to see the differences in resolution. Unfortunately, we're also seeing some raindrops in the air on the Viltrox side, but as we stop down, you'll see that they're not really affecting the resolution a whole lot. Again, I'm surprised at how much of a difference we see just stopping down to f2 with the Viltrox, where it's quite a bit sharper, and it keeps getting better as we stop down to f8. There, it's clear that the rain is reducing resolution on the Viltrox side, but we can at least see how much of that blur was not caused by the rain. Finally, in the corner of the frame, again things look pretty messy at f1.8 with the Viltrox, and stopping down to f2, things look a little bit better, but in this area of the frame, things don't really start looking good until we get to f5.6 and beyond. So to sum up, the Viltrox lens is significantly less sharp than the Sigma at f1.8 up to about f4, and although the differences are minor after that, the Sigma is always a little bit sharper. But that's what I'm shooting from a tripod and viewing the images at 100% from a high-resolution sensor. Let's take a look at some examples from some more typical shooting situations. I've been shooting with this lens off and on for about 4 months now, in a lot of different situations. Here, I decided to drive out to Cape Disappointment on the coast. I didn't have good luck with the weather again. As soon as I was in view of the Cape Disappointment lighthouse, the harsh afternoon light turned into a hazy gray light. I ended up liking a lot of these shots better in black and white. This is in Dead Man's Cove, and the Viltrox lens handled the backlight pretty well with hardly any flare. I went back to the North Head Lighthouse, and I got the only 10 minutes of good light of the day as the sun poked through a thin spot in the clouds and I got some warm light. By the time I had a composition that I liked better, the light was flat and cool again, but the textures still worked well in black and white. I shot this at f4, and it's plenty sharp for me. Since this lens has better resolution than contrast, it really benefits from a little bit of sharpening in post. Another day, I did some shooting around the city of Seattle, starting at the Pike Place Market. Wide-angle lenses are really great for emphasizing elements in the foreground while capturing a lot of background to give the image a sense of place. So I tried to do that when I could. I captured plenty of detail in the gum on this wall in the post alley. Eventually, I started wandering around the city, capturing whatever details I could find, or just bits of pretty light. And even though I know this lens is ultimately not producing the highest resolution possible, I didn't have any problem with my images not being sharp enough. I could shoot across the street to capture several stories of a building, or use the lens's perspective to emphasize a reflection in a roadside puddle. This was actually better as a vertical composition, but that doesn't work very well in a video frame like this. Finally, I decided to take a trip to the farmlands up north of here to see if the daffodils or the tulips were in bloom yet. The daffodils were. For these shots, I stopped down to f8 generally, and I was perfectly happy with the amount of detail that was captured with this Viltrox lens. I can't say that I was 100% happy with the autofocus, though. For some reason, while shooting with the Viltrox lens, I'd periodically just lose focus, even in areas with good contrast and plenty of light, like these cherry branches. Suddenly, it starts hunting for focus for 3 frames. Now, there was some backlight here, but that was just coincidence. I had this same problem regardless of the lighting situation. Here I was focusing on these fiddleheads, and then it just gave up on me. And here, it doesn't get much easier than a brick building for a camera to pull focus on, but all of a sudden I lose it. And again, photographing some cows. Of course, most of the times that I lost focus, the shutter didn't even release, so this is just a small sampling. Still, although this wasn't uncommon, it certainly wasn't the rule. The lens focused just fine most of the time, and when it works, the autofocus is fast and quiet. The lens is perfectly usable, but I would worry about its reliability for shooting professionally. As long as we're talking about autofocus, I should mention that this lens has a minimum focus distance of just under 12 inches, which sounds just fine at first, but it is the worst in this regard of all of the lenses in this class that I have used. When it comes to bokeh in real-world use with this Viltrox lens, I've been pretty happy overall. If you take a look at the left side of this image, the out-of-focus portion really looks nice and smooth overall. It's less jittery than a lot of my f2.8 Tamron lenses, for example. And the same thing is true here. We get good separation and the background is pretty smooth, but if we zoom in a bit, we can start to see some of the rough edges. Around these lights, there's some pretty obvious greenish and yellow color fringing, even with corrections turned on. And these blue and green lights are starting to show some of the artifacts that can be a problem in some other situations. This is an example of the lens's minimum focus distance, but more importantly, if we zoom in again on these white lights in the background, we can see very strong green and blue color fringing. And again, automatic correction doesn't fix it. We can also see some of the concentric circles in these lights that are sometimes called onion rings, along with an odd arch-shaped artifact that comes down from the top left of each one. These artifacts are not terrible, but they do detract from the bokeh a little bit, even in real-world use. And here's just one more example, shot in my parking garage, that shows these onion ring textures a little more clearly. In this situation, the color fringing isn't quite as bad, but it is still visible. And finally, before I wrap this up, let's take a look at how much vignetting this Viltrox lens produces compared to the Sigma f2. These examples have no profile corrections turned on, so real-world use would be more even. The Viltrox has a pretty typical amount of vignetting when it's wide open. with a loss of about 1.2 stops of light in the corners. At f2.8, it's much better, with only about a half a stop of loss, but it doesn't completely disappear until about f5.6, where there's only about a tenth of a stop of loss. The Sigma is actually better than average here. Wide open at f2, there's a loss of about 3/4 of a stop of light in the corners, which is not too bad, and it's almost completely gone by f2.8. So where does that leave us? Well, compared to the Sigma, the Viltrox lens optically controls barrel distortion better than the Sigma does, though the Sigma does ultimately do a better job with software corrections. I like the idea of a stepless aperture ring on the Viltrox, but the implementation of the controls is much more usable on the Sigma, and it has a manual focus switch. These lenses both have pretty good resolution, but again, the Sigma is the clear winner here, especially wide open. The Sigma has modestly better minimum focus distance than the Viltrox. Autofocus on both lenses is fast and quiet, but it was much more reliable on the Sigma. Bokeh is really a matter of personal taste, but the Sigma doesn't suffer from so much color fringing and artifacts in the highlights. The Sigma produces less vignetting and controls it faster, and of course, there's a difference in price. At $639, the Sigma costs about 50% more than the Viltrox, which is significant. But judging the Viltrox lens more generally against the market, I'd give this lens 3 stars for its build quality and controls. The build quality feels much better than that actually, but in a lens like this, I want a smooth-moving aperture ring, an autofocus switch would be nice, and of course, weather sealing. The lens does a good job correcting barrel distortion, so 4 stars there. The resolution in the center is good, but not great towards the edge of the frame, and there are a lot of inexpensive 24mm lenses out there that are quite good these days, though with smaller apertures sometimes. The autofocus speed is very good, and it's also nice and quiet, so it should be good for video and action photography once we get some improvements in the autofocus reliability, which is a concern with my camera. Other cameras might be better, and luckily, there is a USB port on the lens to allow for easy firmware updates. The bokeh is good overall, especially at real-world levels of magnification, but there's enough chromatic aberration and odd artifacts to drop my score to 3.5 stars there. The vignetting performance is pretty good, and when it comes to value, I'd say that you're pretty much getting what you pay for. It's a good, solid lens with good, solid performance at a good price, but not an excellent one. Overall, I would recommend this lens to those of you who are on a tight budget and who are going to use it to shoot 4K video, assuming that you get one with a smoother aperture ring. Because the resolution is great at that size and the autofocus performance is fast and quiet for video. And of course, you get all of that f1.8 light. I'd also recommend it to photographers who shoot events in low light, like concerts or even wedding receptions, where center resolution is the most important, but only if they can't afford a more expensive lens like the Sigma f2, and as I hope you've seen from my images here, the Viltrox lens is perfectly good for general photography, especially on 24 megapixel full-frame sensors, but your expectations should match the price. My next video will be about the Tamron 35 to 150mm f2 to 2.8 zoom lens, so if you want to see that, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click the bell and all of that stuff. Incidentally, if you already have a Viltrox lens, there's currently a Viltrox photo contest on until May 22nd of 2022, with prizes that include lenses, lighting equipment, Fuji cameras, Amazon gift cards, all sorts of stuff. It's free to enter, so I've left a link below. And that's it. I will see you back here soon with a new lens review.